literal ton of people waiting. So we are very, very excited to talk to you today. I'm just going to give a brief overview of what we're going to talk about, give you a brief introduction, and then we're going to go through some selected topics that we have outlined previously that we think are going to be interesting to hear about. If anybody watching has any listener questions, please feel free to drop those in the chat, and producer Gus will send them forward to us. Kevin, I'm going to give your intro, and then I would like to ask you to talk a little bit more about yourself, maybe how you got into what you are doing now, and then we'll go into our topics. So Kevin, you're based in Boulder, Colorado. It's a lovely place to be, especially it's like 70 degrees outside right now, and it's going to be—
Yeah, it couldn't be better right now.
Yeah, exactly. It's a great time to be outside responsibly or indoors working on your strength training with all the sun coming through the windows. You're a strength coach with a focus on endurance athletes. You train a handful of elite high-profile runners and triathletes in Boulder, as well as remote athletes. Recent athletes that you've worked with have been, people from Jake Riley, who placed second at the U.S. Olympic Marathon Trials, Flora Duffy, who won her 5th Xterra World Championship, and won her debut at the 70.3 Ironman South Africa, Sam Long, who's won Ironman Chattanooga, the Ironman Chattanooga 7.3 and 140.6, Ironman Victoria 70.3, Dede Greisbauer, who set the Ultraman World Record at Ultraman Florida, Chris Leiferman, who won Ironman Boulder and top 10 at Kona in his World Championship debut, and Matt Hanson, who won Ironman Boulder at 140.6, Ironman Traverse City, and Ironman Campeche at 70.3. That's a huge list of incredible athletes, and the list goes on because I know from interacting with you over social media, all the people that you're posting about that you're working with in person as well as remote. So that's just a brief overview of the very top. Today we're going to talk about why runners should build full body strength, how to build strength at home, and what runners should do to complement their strength building programs involving diet and sleep routines. So Kevin, huge introduction. Thanks again so much for coming on. Can you tell everybody listening just a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So, I probably come from a little different background. Being on the strength side, I grew up playing team sports, power-based sports. So for me, it was football, baseball, basketball, wrestling. I went into club rugby in college, and then, once you finish all that, those opportunities don't really carry on. So I thought maybe I wanted to go into bodybuilding. Didn't really see that as being a good long-term proposition. I decided to start running one day. 2 miles turned into 4, turned into a half marathon. Next thing you know, it's Ironmans, ultras, all that kind of stuff. So once I got into that, I started viewing everything I did on the training side through the lens of an endurance athlete. And it was kind of like, what kind of things can I do to help myself? And then in turn, what can I do to help out other athletes? So a little bit of a different route to get here. And it obviously means I tend to think more on the strength side. But, hopefully that kind of mix over the last 15 years, as well as just feedback from coaches and people I work with, we've been able to hone some of the process here. And as we can see, we're starting to get some pretty good results.
Yeah, before we even get into, maybe defining what is strength, how do people strength train, how do runners strength train or endurance athletes strength train, the focus on actually adding in strength to an endurance athlete's wheelhouse and repertoire and training regimen, I feel like has taken a kind of dramatic shift over the past couple of years. It used to be, people refer to the 90s of US distance running as kind of like the dark times where people really weren't just competitive globally. And then you have that maybe second running boom in the 90s into the 2000s as everybody started running, their local races, local marathons. But it feels like, especially on the elite side, but even on the recreational side, that there's been this huge shift of priorities in running, and strength training has kind of taken, one of the top places there. Can you talk maybe about the evolution in your eyes of how strength training has become more important for regular distance runners all the way up to the elite athletes that you work with?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I certainly kind of saw this coming from a strength background. It was never something I was going to drop once I got into endurance sports. There's a little meathead that lives inside me, and I've got to go pump iron periodically. So it's just part of my happiness. But yeah, I mean, part of what prompted my move out to Boulder 4 years ago was just seeing that we were kind of on the front side of this process, properly applying strength, periodizing programming, just getting beyond doing some basic band exercises. And Boulder obviously is the Mecca, so it made sense to come on out here and start working on that. The big thing is we talk about injury prevention, and then after that comes sport performance. So obviously we always want to perform better. And the one thing I tell people is you will not get better if you're injured and you're losing training time. So the first step in the hierarchy is we need to make sure we've got some degree of balance. And, I don't mean walking a tightrope. I mean, left side, right side, front, back, those kinds of things. Once we're pretty comfortable, we've got a nice solid base, then we can go into that performance side where we're actually preparing them for maybe it's a specific event. For Jake, we went ahead and did some specific things for Atlanta, just knowing it was going to be hilly. So we can start to shape some of that with the strength process. But if we don't have healthy athletes, it doesn't matter how strong we make them. All we do is give them more ability to get hurt. So, yeah, I think we're going to see even more of an evolution. I think you're going to see more people coming into the process. Obviously, with things like social media and easy access on the web, we're able to learn a lot faster now. If you go back, 20 years, if you didn't go to a seminar or you didn't go through research journals, you really weren't coming up with the info. Now, fortunately, we can go on YouTube, and as long as you're following the right people, you can get a lot of good information. So, yeah, I just expect to see this to continue. And it doesn't matter if you're an age grouper or professionally elite. We all need to stay injury free. We need to stay healthy. And then, yeah, if we've got that under our belt, let's go ahead and work on the performance side.
Awesome. And your own business is KP Performance, as we can see. I like your logo. It's a great logo. But we'll get all into that. And I want to remind people watching that if they have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll get to that. Our first topic is all about strength and why strength is important. Can you maybe define what you consider as strength, and then what can be accomplished through strength training that cannot be accomplished through just regular pure running?
Yeah, so I'll kind of start with, for me, when I use the term strength, that I handle the strength side of the equation, that's not just, getting stronger. For me, that's going to include mobility. It's going to include balancing things out. It's going to include core, pretty much the full gamut of things that we need to stay healthy. So strength is going to be one element in that whole package of things. And, if you look, technically people have been able to run quite well without having a ton of strength training. If you go back and just historically look at people, I'm pretty sure the Africans don't have, a very set gym program. And there are a whole host of reasons why they do so well, but, they'll tend to do hill running, and you can definitely develop some strength there. But you're still going to be limited by load. So you can't be as specific. You're going to be stuck with body weight, the grade of the hill you're running. And, that and plyometrics are about the only two ways outside of using, more traditional strength elements that you're going to improve that. But there's going to be a ceiling there. And just to kind of reiterate what I said earlier, it's all of it, the injury prevention side. And I do tend to get a little redundant sometimes because I want certain things to stick in people's heads. So just view it as, first we're trying to keep the body healthy, and then we're going to worry about the performance side.
Right. And I think anytime that, somebody that has come from the pure endurance side of running that, has only run, and I'm speaking from personal experience here myself, we used to lift a little bit of weights in high school track. And then in college, we would try and get in the gym and do some stuff. But it seems like the evolution of people at least being aware of the fact that they should be incorporating strength is becoming more and more normal. But there still is maybe the hesitancy from an endurance athlete side and approach of exactly what they should incorporate, how they should incorporate it, and why they should. So the next kind of question that I'd have here is how much strength is enough, and how long does it take to build strength? And you mentioned strength is this umbrella that, talks about plyometrics, weightlifting, mobility, because it all ties together. But how much is enough for somebody that has maybe never incorporated it? And then how much is enough for somebody at the very elite level that is running 120 plus miles a week with hard long runs and hard workouts as well?
Yeah, well, and that part of the equation, you could probably get a different answer depending on who you talk to as far as how much strength is enough strength. Coming from a strength background, I don't really see a reason to limit strength development. I don't say, okay, we're at number of pounds, that's where we need to hold it, because if that athlete is able to increase their strength a little bit more without taking away from any of their run training, to me, it's just going to add to that and help them down the road. So I don't put a cap on strength. Now, if we're talking about, how often should somebody be doing it, then you get into the whole periodization concept, where what part of the season are they in, competitive season, off season, preseason. So what we typically do is have our athletes do 2 days of strength. And during the off season, they're going to do, 3 sets or more. And then in season, we're going to cut things down to about 2 sets. And the amount of strength somebody can do in season is going to be relative to how much they did out of season. So one of my big things this year was, getting to just thinking triathletes kind of wrapping it up in October, really focusing on people not waiting until the middle of February or March to then begin their strength training program, because you're limited in your development and you're limited on what you can do once you go into the competitive season. So if we had a little longer window going into it, we're going to be able to do a little bit more, because once you back off of the strength, and this was kind of one of my pet peeves, we'll say, I'd see people put in, 2-3 months of work, get into the competitive season, and out of a concern for their swim, bike, run training, they back off of their strength. Well, for the most part, we're going to get to our championship races later in the season. And at that point, they've already lost the vast majority of their strength gains. So finding ways to keep stuff in, but the ultimate goal is we cannot take away from the run training or swim, bike, run training, and obviously can't take away from race performances. So there are a lot of ins and outs, and that's why I'll kind of seem a little bit vague with some of my answers. And it's just because I don't want somebody to take some very specific piece of information and go out and do it, because there are a whole lot of factors that go into this, as far as where the athlete is, what they need.
Right. And that sounds like, we've had a lot of experts in different fields on the webinars over the past couple of weeks. And that seems the common theme of, everybody that we're talking to that knows a bunch of stuff is that, you don't have just one answer and it's only that way. And the reason you bring up that you should have multiple considerations depending on who you are, I think is great. I would maybe ask this question next of, strength training, is it more beneficial? Let's just say the person we're talking about in this situation is somebody that does 3 sets of 10 push-ups twice a week, and they maybe do some lunges once a week, and that's the full extent of their concept of strength training. Is adding in more specific plyometrics, heavier lifting, general mobility, is that type of training going to be more beneficial for them to just make sure they don't get, or to the best of their ability, not get injured during training? Or is it specifically for improving performance on a race day? For this type of person, what would maybe be the bigger focus for them?
Well, as far as what you described, that would definitely be just the base kind of injury prevention overall strength component versus the actual performance enhancement, because you do need to start moving towards things that are going to have some degree of relationship to the event that person's going to be in. And if I'm taking somebody that races 5Ks, that's going to be different than somebody who's a marathoner, and that's going to be different than an ultramarathoner.
Could you tell me?
I think getting a good broad base, just all the way around, I tend to think of it as structural integrity.
Awesome.
We really get injured for one basic reason, and that's when load exceeds tolerance. So that can either happen by I pick up something really, really heavy and that's too much and boom, I get hurt. Or it can be something small that's done over a long window of time, and then my injury line comes down, and all of a sudden that small stress causes an injury. So what we're trying to do is make sure we stay ahead of that curve, where our tissue is always prepared to handle, whether it's the training, the racing, whatever it may be, so that we don't cross over that line of injury.
You mentioned that a 5K specialist versus somebody training for the marathon versus ultra marathon, or maybe even throw in sprint triathlon versus Ironman, they'll have differences. Could you maybe give 1 or 2 differences that you would generally incorporate in a strength training program for a 5K athlete versus ultra marathon, or sprint triathlon all the way versus Ironman athlete?
Yeah, so probably the biggest way to think about it is the shorter the event, the more you're going to be relying on some power elements or variations of power elements. So probably the clearest example would be taking somebody like Dede doing an Ultraman, and then taking somebody like Flora who's racing ITU draft legal. Those are very, very different ways of going about a race. So each are going to have the same elements in there. So you're going to have power, you're going to have agility, you're going to have your basic strength, and obviously your mobility, core, and all that kind of stuff. But the athlete who's going to race on a shorter track, then I'm going to shift and give them a little bit more on that power side of the equation. Whereas the athlete who's going to do something like Ultraman, we're going to keep power in there, but a lot of it's going to be on kind of what we call muscle endurance long. So that ability to produce contractions over longer windows of time. And I look at it the same way, 5K person, you're more likely to need a kick going into the end of that race or at some point, or you may need to match surges and then be able to hang on. So we're going to go ahead and train them that way, where we give them some quick pops and then we settle in. Whereas your marathoner, for the most part, and obviously, Jake, it came down at the end there and there was a big sprint finish. So we did throw a little bit of that in there for them. So that's the basic thing. Everybody has the same elements included. It's just how much weight do we put in towards the power, and that's going to go for shorter endurance. And then how much do we do that for longer endurance?
And when you say power, do you mean things like plyometrics or heavier lifting or certain type of mobility? Maybe what's one example of for that shorter?
Definitely going to be that combination of the plyometrics and heavier lifting. So, awesome. Everything kind of stacks on itself. So first we think good base strength. Mm-hmm. From base strength, then we kind of go to maximum strength. And this may make more sense if we go in the beginning, you're going to do 3 sets of 10 to 12, and that's going to be your base strength. Then from there, you're going to bring the repetitions down, maybe 4 to 6, and you're starting to load heavier. Once you get through those windows, then you're going to go ahead and put plyometrics on top of that. Whereas if you went, say, plyometrics right out of the gate and you didn't have the other lifting in, you'll see a quick spike in performance, but then you're going to level out. So I really encourage people to think of this in the same way they do their run training or their swim bike run training. We don't go out and apply just one stress or one type of run. We're going to go through shorter, faster, some mid-range, and then long. So we need to look at our strength training pretty much in the same way.
Awesome. Yeah, I think it's super interesting because when people, again, coming from, an endurance side, they understand the concept of, okay, I have my, base mileage that I might be doing. And then I'm going to add in some of my thresholds and some strides. And then I'm going to work on specific intervals or fartleks or hills or stuff. So that concept already makes sense to people. Just hearing it put into practice from a strength training should help that message kind of click in people's heads, I think. We have a couple listener questions that have already trickled in, so I want to get your take on some of these. This first question comes from Yop. He says, as I am a triathlete, do these functional strength exercises differ for swimming or biking?
Yeah, there are going to be some differences in there. And we tend to think in terms of patterns versus muscles. So obviously, if you look at your position in the water and what you're doing there versus being on the bike, there are going to be some differences. You might look at a bigger difference, say, between your bike and your run, because now we have 2 entirely different types of stress going on. So on a bike, there's no eccentric phase. Basically, eccentric is when the muscle is contracting but getting longer. So on a bike, it's just all concentric. So I may do some things to help facilitate that side of the equation if somebody's a pure cyclist or mix it in for a triathlete. Whereas with running, we are going to have that eccentric. We're going to get some of that elastic return. So plyometrics might be a little bit more important for somebody who's going to have a run element in there, whereas maybe not quite as important for somebody that's, say, swimming or just as a pure cyclist. So yeah, there are going to be some differences in there. And again, it's just the whole package, and you shade one way or the other based on the specific sport.
Awesome. Next question here is from Mark Robert. He says, I also come from a strength background. I'm looking to improve running performance without losing muscle mass. So maybe this sort of question is directed at for somebody that has come from a strength background and they've started running more. How might they go about things differently? Or is it the same for trying not to lose muscle mass while improving their actual running performance?
I'd probably start with kind of wanting to have an idea of where their muscle mass is. So we don't need a lot of muscle mass to be an endurance athlete. As a matter of fact, it's going to be detrimental. So no 2 ways about it. If you are carrying more weight, whether that's body fat or muscle weight, it's going to be harder. You're going to have to produce more effort to get to the same speeds. For me personally, because I just don't want to give up a whole lot of my strength training, I fully acknowledge the fact that, I could potentially be a little bit faster as an endurance athlete if I went ahead and stripped down maybe another 15 or so pounds. In my particular world, my quality of life and what I enjoy doing, that's not a trade-off that I'm willing to have. So it really comes down to the primary goal. And if your primary goal is to become the best endurance athlete you can be, then bringing your weight down to a normal weight, not worrying about holding a bunch of muscle mass is where you want to go. And you just simply kind of shift some of your strength training down, that 4, 6, or 8 repetition range. So hypertrophy is going to be more that 10, 12 or higher. Whereas if we stay a little bit lower, you're not going to have as much muscle size, but you're still going to maintain that strength. And I'd say anybody that has a strength background and your goal is to be the best endurance athlete, that's your route to go. Just go ahead and bring those reps down and keep it below the hypertrophy window. Yet you're still going to keep all that strength that you had. And then it'll just naturally come off a little bit as far as some of the mass as you get into your volume with your training.
Awesome. Yeah, no, great answer. I have one last question for this section. This is from Sloan Alexander, and they say, trying to get really strong in my core, is there a routine or specific workouts I should do, certain things to complement my goal of running a sub 3-hour marathon? How many days per week? So I get this could be broken into maybe 3 specific things to target. So is there a specific routine or workouts for what you define as core, and then complementing the goal of getting faster? How does that work? And then how many days per week? And I believe you've said 2 to 3 is the general recommendation. But I'd love to get your input on this question.
Yeah, so when I look at, with programming, again, taking the whole ball of wax, my 2 to 3, those are the pure strength days, I call it. But for me, it's never a pure strength day. So the way I program is we're going to have core elements, we're going to have mobility and all of those things, but the big time strength elements are there twice a week. I'm still going to ask people to do 1 or maybe 2 other days of just a core workout, and then give them 1 or 2 other days just focusing on mobility. So in my opinion, if we're training, 5 to 7 days a week, then we need to touch on the body 5 to 7 times a week. And again, it doesn't mean you're doing deadlifts 5 to 7 times. It just means that you're going to make sure that you're addressing soft tissue and core and some of those things. As far as a specific routine, this is definitely one of those. There are a whole lot of different ways to go about it. So what I do is just kind of think, positions, or, for the core, we're going to talk about anti. So anti-extension, and that would be your things like planks, lateral flexion, side planks, going into a bridge, and then covering the shoulders. So I tend to look at it as about 5 areas. So you're going to have the front side, and we tend to think of that as abdominals. We're going to go to the back side, so posterior chain, glutes, things like that. Lateral, which is going to be stuff like lateral hip work, as well as your side planks, and then going into some kind of scapular work to make sure that everything around the shoulder girdle is nice and happy, and then around the hips, kind of getting into the inner thigh. So we tap into that with every single workout we do. We're going to hit each of those areas. So if you're really trying to get a big jump start on the core, then you may add volume to it. So maybe you do a plank, then you get on a ball and do a rollout or some other things. But as far as something really specific, that's the be all end all, comes back to the individual again. Whatever we see in initial eval, we identify those weaknesses, and that's where we're going to put a little more focus for the person.
Yeah, I always think that, again, that's the thing, talking to experts in the field, it's never one general thing that you can always do. It always comes back to the person, which I think is very helpful. Before we move on to the next section, I would like to ask you to plug maybe your social media or a website where people can see more information, because I know from following you on social media, you post a lot of great examples of athletes in the day-to-day, maybe that, behind the curtains, just a simple, mobility routine that looks very ordinary, but you put some information and more context on that. So for people watching, I'd like you to give the chance to plug your social media or more information about KP Performance.
Yeah, certainly. So Instagram, KP Performance, KP_performance, I believe is how it's set up. And, that's where I tend to post most things, and then it just gets kicked over to Facebook. As far as the website, kpperformanceboulder.com. And now, going into this, I hadn't done a whole lot of work on the website, but given the nature of what's going on now and the fact that we're all relying a little bit more on social media to kind of find information and stay connected, the goal is to go ahead and put a lot more work into providing some more content on the website so that we can give people, again, some of these general things. Here's a core routine, and it's going to cover everything. Doesn't mean it's the one for everybody, but just to start giving people some options. And yeah, I do try to provide a little bit of a highlight as to, what we're doing when we go through taper windows, the different things we're doing coming out of that. And then I usually do my best to explain why we're doing what we're doing, so that somebody doesn't just see a series of exercises and think, oh, well, that's just something I should do. And it's race week, and all of a sudden they're doing something silly that's going to hurt their race. Right. So there's always going to be some kind of an explanation in there, just to provide some information and background on why we're doing what we do.
Right. I think
So
the
yeah, pretty much KP Performance Boulder is the website, and KP Performance on Instagram as well as on Facebook.
yeah, I think the why is always that most important thing that you deliver instead of just the what or even the how. The why and the reasoning behind it is the thing that I always find the most helpful. Seeing the post. Topic number 2 we have pertains to this unique situation that we've found ourselves in over the past couple of weeks, and we don't necessarily know when this unique situation is going to necessarily end, of being relegated more towards your home. So this next topic focuses on how can runners build strength at home. Let's say that you're in my situation and I have a apartment gym that's 50 feet away from me, but it's closed because we're not allowed to go in the gym where multiple people can interact. So now I am relegated to my home. I cannot go to the gym and have access to the things I normally had. Can runners build strength at home if they do not have access to a gym like they're normally used to?
So this may be the part where people are not going to get the answer they want out of the question. So I'll say it this way. If you have never done any kind of strength training, yes, you can develop some strength at home, simply working with your body weight. Obviously, that's going to plateau. Now, if you've been pretty consistent in the gym and you're moving around some pretty good weight, you're just not going to be able to recreate that at home, outside of having some kind of external load to add to the body. So what I do is tend to, shift the focus. Instead of saying, how can we try to make something strength oriented happen at home when we don't have equipment? The better question is, what can I do to become a better runner when we do come out of all this? And that's going to be all of that supplemental stuff that nobody really likes to do. So from, digging in on your core stuff to working on some of your pattern drills. So, things like how your leg tracks, and you could get into some running drills. So that's really where I'm trying to get everybody to shift their mental focus. If they do not have any equipment, we're going to keep consistency. So I'm a big fan of routine. I want them to do, the same number of days in the week. We're just going to shift it. And the focus is anything and everything for that athlete that's going to help them pop out on the other side better, and not just spin their wheels trying to chase something that is really a challenging thing to do if you don't have some sort of equipment. So I know that's kind of a bummer. It's hard to develop strength if you don't have something to pick up. But it doesn't mean there aren't things you can work on. And, most people don't spend a lot of time, whether it's form drills or some of those other things. And I get it. When you're in your, regular life, we'll say you got your full-time job, you're training, or you're elite in your training, then, getting to those things, it goes way down the list of important things. But now we obviously have a little bit more time. So just start looking at some of those things and work on what you can work on, and try not to stress over the things that you can.
Yeah, this next follow-up here piggybacks completely off of that. Is there a big difference between building strength at home versus building strength at the gym? And again, going back to that sort of initial definition that we had at the beginning of the show, of strength isn't literally just being able to pick up, all your grocery bags with 2 hands and only making one trip from the car. Strength is multifaceted, and you can improve your ability as a runner, like you just mentioned, while at home. But maybe touch on what the differences are between building strength at home versus getting in the gym and being able to move that heavy weight around.
Yeah, so to continue to progress, progressive overload is the concept. So we have to continue to apply more of a load and then have the body respond to that. And all that happens in about 3-week chunks. So if you kind of look at a very traditional, maybe run setup, it's 3 weeks and then a step back. That's the same kind of concept. It's because the body's going to adapt in roughly 3-week windows. So if you don't have that external load, that strength element is not going to improve if you can't continue to add to that. But if you really double down on your hip stability, your hip mobility, the stronger you can make that supporting cast, when you come back to it and you start lifting again, it's going to make your lifting even better. So you're going to end up in a better place no matter what, if you stick with working on the things that you can work on. And again, I know that's kind of a bummer of an answer. We'd look for maybe some techniques like you could do isometric holds and, fast tempo, slow tempo with your strength training at home. But those aren't really going to be game changers for you. Now, if all of a sudden you develop the ability to spread your toes and mobility in your midfoot and stuff that you just never would work on when you don't have the time, that's going to serve you a lot better down the road.
Yeah, super interesting. You mentioned some kind of specific exercises there. We've had Coach Bobby McGee or Dr. Ginger Gutschall on, and they've given us a couple examples of some exercises that they prefer to recommend to people. If you had to pick one or two exercises to recommend to somebody that might be watching this and wants something accomplishable, maintainable, and practical, what would be one or two sort of basic building blocks that you might recommend?
We're always going to kind of come back to the glute concept. And it probably seems like a real cop-out go-to answer for everybody in my industry. The joke is you could go in and it's like, oh, my toe hurts. Well, your glute's not working. And technically that could be part of the problem there. So I'm always going to have a lot of emphasis there. But I think probably mobilizing your hips. So getting your hip flexors loose, the ability to externally rotate the hip, and then getting your glutes working. So your bridge, your lateral band steps, things like that. That's really where I would tend to have people focus, because we're sitting on our glutes all day. Obviously now we're at home more often, so we're sitting on them more, and we're just kind of decreasing signals into that area. So I would just say, take your choice of things, but, something like a couch stretch for your hip flexor, something like a pigeon stretch for rotation, and then going into a bridge to get your glutes on, and then maybe going through some band work with lateral steps just to make sure they keep working.
And that's something easy enough that it's not necessarily going to leave somebody super sore and they won't be able to run,
Correct.
but it's enough that they can start to incorporate and maybe have that one exercise that they check off that they can start incorporating in.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'd be happy too to go ahead and put a couple of things together and we can get it posted through Stryd.
Yeah.
You guys can come back and check it out later.
Yeah, absolutely. Whenever we get a link to that, if somebody's watching a little bit down the road, we'll put it in the description or link down in the video. Last question in this section is, what are common mistakes when runners try to build strength, and what should they be mindful of? I feel like this is a huge thing now, as we talked about earlier, the onset and the increase of people being aware that they need to increase or introduce strength training. The need for people to be mindful of what not to do is just as important as the recommendations and facilitating a program for people. So what should people be mindful of, and what should they maybe look out for what not to do as they introduce some strength training?
Yeah, so two things I would look at. One is pretty broad-based, and it's just looking at time windows. So where you are relative to your competitive season. If people decide in the middle of their season, or I've even seen this, 5 or 6 weeks out from their main marathon, oh, I need to do some strength. And all of a sudden they jump into things that may be very, very solid concepts, but it's a horrible window, because by the time they realize what they've done is actually taking too much out of them, you don't have that ability to recover and then be ready for your race. So I think the timing of what you're doing and when you're doing it is probably going to be the biggest thing there. And then, the other mistake is just people tend to go, okay, I need to get better strength. Therefore, I know that squatting is going to be good. I know that deadlifting is going to be good. And on average, what we run into is your ability to produce force or power is going to override your ability to stabilize. Simply meaning, if you don't have a regular core routine and you're not solid in that department, you're going to be able to squat more weight with your legs than maybe your low back can stabilize. So I'm always a big fan of taking somebody, if they haven't been doing any of this stuff, in your first 3 to 4 weeks, we're going to hammer the core, work on your patterns, and then start to incorporate more of the loading component, and then just gradually build that. So I think people dive in because, I need to go heavy, 4 to 6 is what everybody tells me. While that's a true statement, it may be a horrible thing if you haven't been doing anything, and it could be a quick route to getting your back hurt. So right. Making sure that you progress properly. So I'd say that's probably the biggest thing as far as runners deciding I need to do strength, and then how they start to incorporate it.
Right. And that's the same sort of thing as if somebody shows up to a group run, maybe a couple of months ago, and their friend says, yeah, I've been doing these hill sprints once a week and they've been magnificent. I do 15 times 20-second hills with recovery back down. And somebody immediately tries to go do it the next day, but they haven't built up from 5 hill sprints, 8, 10, 12, 15. So the same sort of concept people should be aware of for running. It translates to adding the strength training. We have a couple more. I always tell
people, when you are watching social media and you're seeing some of your favorite athletes doing really cool stuff, remember there was an entire window and process that took them to that point. So just because you see something that makes sense and it's a good idea, doesn't mean you start it that way that day. So progressions and regressions, I believe, are pretty important.
Right.
Know when you need to back off, and then know when you can start to accelerate it.
The other danger, I like this term for social media, is the things you see most are people's highlight reel, but you never see their blooper reel. So you never see when they fail for holding a core exercise or something like that. So definitely something to be mindful of. We have a couple more listener questions that trickled in. First one here is, could adding too much strength be detrimental in gaining extra mass when this may not be what is desired? So this kind of touches on what we talked about earlier, but it's maybe a slightly different thing of adding too much strength. Is it possible for a completely endurance-focused athlete to bulk up too much where it hurts their performance?
So if you look at kind of a, we'll say a traditional endurance athlete, maybe somebody that was a runner, starting in junior high, high school, and then coming up, odds are their body type is not the bodybuilder. So they're not going to just put on massive amounts of muscle. So I think in general, the concern of putting on too much mass isn't, overly well founded with endurance athletes, simply because, I could point to a whole host of guys that lift and their whole goal is to get bigger, and they're not just growing exponentially because they lift heavier weights. And that's the only thing they're doing. So if you have your endurance in there, it's probably going to keep it pretty well managed. That being said, something that I'm trying to get myself more into with athletes is looking at kind of a bigger way of viewing composition. So taking circumference measurements, the neck, the chest, the shoulders, all the way down the body, then looking at their body weight, and then maybe pulling skin fold measurements where we're not trying to go body fat percentage. I'm just looking at, did I pull 4 millimeters or 6 millimeters? And then if I see an endurance athlete where they're, a runner and their chest and their shoulder measurements are getting bigger, I know that, that's not a road that we need to go down. So that's another way I'm trying to get that system put into place right now, where we can just, periodically 6-8 weeks before big events, get an idea of where that athlete's composition is, and also just see, are we inadvertently putting on some upper body mass? And then I can go ahead and make changes in their programming. So it is possible. Just in general, it's less likely when we're talking about somebody that comes from endurance, and we're not looking at that short, massive squat build. We're looking at kind of a thinner athlete. I don't think you're going to be in too much trouble.
Do you typically use the skin fold measurement or caliper measurement versus something like a DEXA scan? I know has gotten a lot more popular recently, but the whole concept of DEXA sitting in a pod and having all those compositions taken is a little bit more cumbersome and less practical for most people versus skin fold measurements.
Yeah, and it depends on the goal. If your goal is to figure out an exact body fat percentage, then you're going to look at hydrostatic. You're probably going to look at the DEXA scan versus, say, skin fold calipers or electrical impedance. So for me, I'm less concerned with trying to say, okay, athlete, you're at 11% or 9%. I'm more concerned with, if I'm going to pull 9 different measurements off of their body, did it change? Did I pull 8 millimeters last time and we're at 4 millimeters now? I know that athlete is getting leaner. Or the flip side is true. If I see an athlete that's losing weight, but at the same time their skin fold measurements are going up, that's an indication to me that we're now stripping off muscle. So I don't use it to try and say we're at X body fat. For me, I'm triangulating between their circumference measurements, their body fat skin fold measurement, and then also looking at the body weight. So just looking at those 3 pieces of information versus any one by itself. If you want body fat, yeah, you're going to need to do something like probably hydrostatic or the DEXA scan.
Awesome. Yeah. Super interesting. That was just my own personal question because I was curious about that. Daniel Greer asks, guessing most people don't have much swimming going on, maybe replace that with some strength stuff. So this is also a multifaceted question. If you're usually swimming to practice technique or endurance, now you don't have that type of stress. Is it an appropriate time to sub out when you would normally have your swim sessions for adding in these type of specific strength sessions into your training program?
Yeah, and actually I put a post up kind of referencing this a little bit. It was more of a public service announcement kind of post where, my concern is, let's say at the elite level, if somebody's, 7+ hours a week in the pool, what we don't want to do is get out of the water and then grab your bands and try to recreate 7 hours of that training and assume that somehow that's going to cause us to keep our swim fitness and then get back in the pool and be where we are. So we just need to accept the fact that right now, if you're a triathlete, if you're a swimmer, you don't have access to water. So your swimming is going to suffer. And those first few weeks when you get back into swim training, they're not going to be fun at all. But that doesn't mean there aren't things you can do to help work on that. So I'm really a big proponent of make sure your thoracic mobility is in check, a good extension and rotation. Make sure your shoulder mobility is there, stability around the shoulder, so between the shoulder blades. So I'm going to put a lot of focus into the athletes working on strengthening those areas, mobilizing those areas. And then we will throw in, 3 to 4 times a week, dry land concepts where we are taking the band, and going through more of that swim motion. But my concern is somebody all of a sudden trying to recreate the same number of reps because that's a pretty quick way to get a shoulder injury. So don't try to make it a 1-for-1. Absolutely, there are things you can do that are going to help in the long run, but just think overall development versus trying to sub out one type of stress for another.
And trying to do a flip turn out of the water gets a little bit messy, and it's a little bit impractical too. Cynthia
like
asks,
to see those videos.
Yes, exactly. Tag KP Performance with your except don't do that. Don't do that. Cynthia asks, "Hi, Evan and Kevin. Can you touch on what the difference is from taking extended versus shorter rest between sets when lifting light or heavier weights?" So the thing that I'm very familiar with talking to other distance runners, specifically like I talked just a little bit ago about adding hill sprints, is a normal endurance distance runner gets very impatient when they all of a sudden have to take longer rests, because that is not what you're used to in running. It's just, I'm going to run for an hour straight, or I'm going to run for 3 hours straight, or take very little rest between my reps. But strength training is a very different stimulus. Can you talk a little bit more about the differences that you might have to consider when you're talking about recovery in between efforts for strength training?
Yeah, so similar to, let's say, a track workout where in one case the focus is the time of the interval, and another case the focus is going to be the recovery interval. So it may be a fixed recovery interval, and then there's some variability with the actual work interval, or we may want somebody to run the work interval at a specific number. We give them as much rest as we need to accomplish that. Same thing in the gym. So if my goal was the pure strength side of the equation, I'm going to give that athlete, probably a couple of minutes in between sets to make sure they can produce their best effort. If we look at people like powerlifting, Olympic lifters, it's things like doing 2 reps and then taking 6 minutes of recovery before they go back to do that next set. Now that's on the extreme end. For an endurance athlete, I don't think there's ever a need to go through that process. So if you have a shorter recovery, it is going to have some of a limiting effect on the output that goes into the next set of whatever the exercise is. So if your goal is strength, give yourself, probably closer to a minute with that. And if the goal is a little bit of strength, but just keeping things moving, I think you can go down as low as about 30 seconds of recovery. So 30 to 60 is about the number I would look at.
Awesome, but not not walking for 10 seconds and then immediately trying to do another heavy 10 squats or something like that.
Correct. Yep.
Awesome.
You'll find that there's a big decrease. That second set would be significantly less than the first, and then the third would follow suit. So, and that may be an easy way to gauge it too. If you were doing, let's say, pull-ups, and you could do 10, and then you waited 20 seconds and you could do 3, odds are you probably need to give yourself a little more recovery. So that might be a field technique you can use to help judge what you need your recovery to be.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great pointer. One last question for this segment, and then we'll move on to the third block of questions that we have. This comes from Jim. He says, "What is the time frame for these blocks of base training than to other elements?" So you've referred to, the fitness kind of adaptations are made in about these 3-week blocks when you're talking about normal training. But what is the time frame for these blocks of base training and then progressing to other elements?
Yeah, you're looking at, anywhere from, I'd say ballpark 6 weeks to 12 weeks. And it's going to be a little bit different with endurance athletes. If you have sports where the whole goal is to peak for one single event, it's a little bit different because you can map out your whole 12 months based on that. When you look at somebody like a triathlete, typically by, March, April, everybody's racing, and then that could extend into, World Championships in October, even going into November, December. So you're not going to be able to peak, say, 4, 5, 6 times in a season. So you're going to look at setting yourself up for that particular event. Now, I like to go through, as soon as they come off their off season, take a normal break, and then come back to it. And you've got about 6 weeks of what they call anatomical adaptation. And that's just your basic strength development. And that's getting your connective tissue working, developing a little bit of base strength. Then after that, you go into, a 6 to 12 week window of your 10 to 12 reps, and then go into, maybe a 6 to 12 week window where you're dropping those reps down. So a lot of this is going to be based on the individual again. But if we think we're going to adapt in about a 3-week window, maybe getting a couple of rounds of that when you're going through one specific type of stress would be a pretty good idea. And it doesn't mean you quit all the other things. It just means that's where the emphasis of your training is.
And that might be something for people to consider too, of if you start to incorporate a round of strength training, don't give up after the first 10 to 15 days, because you have to give yourself time to adapt to that. And really to see that kind of progress like you're talking about is ideally you'd give yourself at least 6 weeks of time. So you have that first 3 weeks, and then you add or you change on top of that first 3 weeks to the next 3 weeks, and then you can start to see progress over there. So it's not just that quick hit and you're all of a sudden going to gain 20 pounds of muscle and be super efficient. You have to give yourself kind of time to incorporate that with these blocks that you're referring to.
Yeah, absolutely. And the very initial improvement somebody's going to see, particularly if they've not done any strength training, in that first 14-day window you're talking about, they're neurological adaptations where you're simply turning on more motor units. So, we could say, oh, you're stronger because you're able to lift more weight. But in that window, we didn't increase the cross-sectional size of the fibers or any of that kind of stuff. So, yeah, those initial adaptations are neurological, but then it's 3 to 4 weeks before you get that true change in the muscle tissue or cardiovascular, whatever system you're stressing. So, yeah, having a couple of rounds of that where you layer one on top of the other, and then the consistency over time is really where the value is going to come in.
Awesome. So we're going to move on to the third set of questions that we prepared. If anybody else has any other questions, please drop them in the chat here so we can get those before we wrap up here today. Topic number 3 is how to complement a strength routine. If you're doing, heavy lifting, plyometrics, mobility, what really matters, and I've heard this phrase, is the other 23 hours out of the day, right? It's what can you do to actually help your body recover. So in order for a strength routine to be successful, what does an athlete need to do? And this is a big open-ended question, but for a successful strength training program, what would be something that a successful athlete would do on top of that just strength training?
Yeah, the good news is this answer kind of covers it for whether you're talking about the strength side of the equation or your run or swim, bike, run training. So recovery, I don't know if it's a hot topic today. There's several books that are out right now, and I've been going through a bunch of them. And it's anywhere from, we're trying to find evidence-based things to do to help the body recover so that we can then perform better. And as we go through it, we tend to get really focused on, some of it's probably social media, some of it's marketing, but we're going to see a product that's put out there, and it'll say we've got a clinical trial that shows blah, blah, blah. And so we tend to dive into all of those, whether it's a supplement, whether it's a training technique. And what we end up skipping over are the basics. So sleep and nutrition, those are your 2 primary ways you're going to help supplement all of this other stuff that you're doing. So sleep is number 1. And that's kind of been my going into 2020, what I'm trying to beat everybody over the head with is, are you getting enough sleep? Last week, I sent a sleep questionnaire out to all the athletes that I work with so that they could kind of go through and see where they are and see where they can maybe make improvements. Are you getting 8 to 10 hours of sleep as a competitive athlete? If you're cutting it down to 5 or 6, and then you're taking a bunch of other supplements to help yourself recover, you could save some money and just sneak in an extra hour or so of sleep. And then nutrition is going to be the thing. So all kinds of products out there, and I'm not against products, but if you don't have your basics nailed down, just your basic intake, quality foods, that sort of thing, then all of those supplements are not going to be the game changer. And one of the ways I'm relaying this to people is if you look at, say, product A that showed a 3% boost in performance, product B that also showed a 3%, product C also showed a 3%. If you do all of those, you're not going to end up with a 9% boost in your performance. So we kind of get into the how much of this is, upstairs. And again, it doesn't matter. If you're performing better, you're performing better. But you don't get an aggregate performance boost if you take on all of these things that do have evidence that show they work. So pick a couple of things, but really focus on your sleep and your nutrition. Those are going to be the big things that help you recover.
Awesome. Yeah, you just covered a couple points of this. And the one other point that I wanted to ask is practically how much time would somebody have to dedicate during their week? How much extra time does somebody have to add in to start seeing some benefits or to, kind of start triggering their body to see these adaptations for a strength training routine?
So we're going to say twice a week. And if you had twice a week where you were covering everything in the body twice a week and you were keeping your mobility in there and all that kind of stuff, then that 2 times a week, that's where I'll see, definitely going to have some changes there. Dropping it down to 1, I don't really see a whole lot of benefit there. And then obviously if you can get to 3 or more, you may see a little bit more. But remember, that's the strength component. So if we're talking about deadlifting, squatting, lunging, all those sorts of things, that's going to be a 2 to 3 times a week deal, but then keeping core and the other stuff in there as well.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And what might be a general sort of time allotment if somebody is adding 2 to 3 times per week? Could they get everything done in 15 minutes? Do they need to do 75 minutes? Is it 45 minutes? What's a maybe very general rule of thumb with a plus or minus on the end?
Yeah, I try to keep everybody, ballpark 45 minutes. So 45 to 60 minutes. I think if you're spending over 60 minutes, you're probably better suited to divide some of that up into a couple of different days. And if you're doing only 15 or 20 minutes, then there's just no way you can cover the full range of things that you need to cover. So if I had 20 minutes and I went in and did a bunch of leg strength, great, my legs are stronger. But if my mobility is still poor and my stability is still poor, I'm going to end up with a problem down the road. So a lot of times I'll have people give me whatever their parameters are. So if somebody tells me 20 minutes, I'm going to give them the most important things for them to do in that 20 minutes. So the answer for your question is, I think 45 to 60 minutes, but then having some days where it is 15 to 20 and all you're doing is working on something like mobility.
Right. Awesome. Let's see, a couple more listener questions before we wrap up here. Leonardo says, when you mean 2 to 3 sets, is it the same weight for all sets? And that's the first part of the question. The second part is also, according to the type of training, if you're 5K or marathon from that power to endurance side, do you at the same time, so the question is, or marathon power endurance, same time during eccentric and concentric phase? So the part that I kind of understand a little bit more is when you say 2 to 3 sets, use the same weight for all sets, and then maybe talking about eccentric versus concentric phases for power or endurance athletes.
Yes, I mean, the 2 to 3 sets, same weight, it can be the same weight, or you can go through kind of that pyramid concept where set 1 is at a certain weight for X reps, set 2 you add, in my opinion, let's say somebody's doing 3 sets and they're doing 3 sets of 10, and that third set of 10 and they're adding weight each time. So that third set of 10 is when they really feel like they stress themselves. My question is, what did set 1 and 2 do if you were using the same weight? So if you're going to be increasing weight, then you're probably going to be decreasing reps. If you're increasing weight and doing the same number of reps, you've probably lost some of it with those first couple of sets. So that's probably the biggest thing I would say. And I think if I'm understanding this right, with the concentric, eccentric, maybe some of the tempo concepts, like maybe having a 5-second eccentric and then going through a very quick concentric phase. And those are just some of the tricks that you try to throw in. But, again, go back to your basics. So if you have not consistently over a year or longer worked on your basic fundamental movements and your basic strength, then you don't need to really toy around with a lot of these other real complex concepts.
Totally. Let's see. Nikhil asks, should I run in a small area in my home or stationary bike or spot jog or skipping? I'm a runner with about 50 kilometers or 30 miles a week average. So this is maybe for practicality of a current situation. Should they run in a small area around their home or just use a stationary bike, run in place, add some skipping or jump roping? What would be your kind of just best answer for that question?
If you can challenge the cardiovascular system, but, my concern would be if you're running in a really small space. Take a track athlete, where we do get concerned about asymmetries depending on how much time they're spending on the track running around in a circle. So that would be my first concern, trying to, recreate. I'm going to do a 10-mile run, but I'm going to do it in a 10 by 10 room. I think you may be causing more problems than actually doing yourself good. So if you're after the cardiovascular system, then you're probably going to want to play with more of those concepts where you have kind of that HIIT concept, where you're going really high intensity for a short window and then some recovery, repeated rounds of that, if you're limited on space and things like that. But it sounds like that might be a question more for your specific endurance coach versus the strength side of the equation.
Right. William asks, how do you feel about the Pilates reformer? And I'm not familiar with this. I'm familiar with the concept of Pilates, but I'm not familiar with the Pilates reformer, so if you have any thoughts on that matter.
Yeah, so I assume they're talking about kind of like the Cadillac, the machine, and it has springs on it, and that's where you're providing a lot of your resistance. And then there's a lot of great body control in that. So, I definitely come from the school of thought where there aren't many things that I ever look at and go, oh, no, we just shouldn't do that. Coming from a strength background, I do believe we need to load the tissue. So we're going to need something maybe that moves you beyond things like that. But at the same time, if somebody doesn't have any experience with it, and I say, okay, one option is here's a strength routine where you're going to go lift weights, or another option is you're going to go and use the Pilates reformer, and they give me 10 minutes of strength and they hate it, and then they walk out of the facility, but they go ahead and do 45 minutes on the reformer. By all means, let's get you on the reformer. So I think all methods of exercise are very valid and they all have their purpose. But if you're going to work on improving strength, then you need to create more of a progressive overload so that over time you actually have something that you're adapting to. But I pull from all these things. I pull yoga concepts in, Pilates concepts in. I think you just have to take information and figure out how to apply it to that specific individual based on where they are. But yeah, I love all of that stuff.
Awesome. General question here, creating a weekly running program, would you recommend having functional strength done on the easy running days? So let's say I run in the morning and I do gym work in the evening, or add them during the allocated rest days. So would you have an athlete, would you prefer they do it on a day where they're already doing some sort of aerobic intensity, or would you leave it all the way for when they're completely recovered and doing the activity completely fresh?
Yeah, so the catchphrase we use with this is hard days hard, easy days easy. So I always program where, typically you're going to have your 2 quality run days out of the week. A lot of people are on, say, a Tuesday, Friday setup. So Tuesday and Friday, that's where I apply the strength. And even if they have doubles, like a lot of times we'll see do their hard session in the morning, then they'll come in, around the afternoon and we do strength, and then they have their second run later in the day. And the reason is we want recovery to be recovery. So I wouldn't want you to take, say, a Tuesday and you go bang out a hard track session and then turn around Wednesday and go stress your legs with strength, and Thursday, a little bit of recovery. And then Friday, you're back to, hitting another hard run session. So it's better to match up the hard stress on the same day so that you end up with recovery truly being recovery.
Awesome. Next question here is, are there specific exercises to help with running downhills?
So the eccentric phase of a strength move, that's probably, so it's not so much the exercise itself as focusing on that eccentric phase. So if I'm squatting, maybe I'm going to take the weight and I'm going to have about a 10-second lowering and then come back up with maybe 1 second. Because all of that downhill running, it is the eccentric load. And that's why it's hard to run uphill. It's not as hard to run downhill, but you will be way more sore when you run downhill versus running uphill. So you have that impact, and then basically what your quad's doing is preventing you from falling on your face when you land. So it's not letting your knee bend. Well, that quick bend and that contraction of the muscle getting longer, that's where a lot of those small tears occur. So focusing on the eccentric phase of your strength movements can help carry over with some of the downhill running. But obviously, in a smart way, putting some downhill running into your programming, not maybe as a general concept, but if you have a race coming up where there's going to be some downhill running, then yeah, you probably want to go ahead and try to tap into that system as well.
Awesome. Last 3 quick questions we have here from the listeners. Cynthia says, what's your opinion on using creatine for endurance athletes?
I am a believer, and that's some of what I was just going through in one of the books that I was reading. Using creatine, and again, it's just taking the regular dosage each day, not going through some loading concept or any of those other things. It's going to help facilitate with your strength workouts, and then all of that in the long run is what's going to help your running. So don't think of something like creatine as, I'm going to take a big spoonful and then go out and run, and I'm going to run better. You need to think about this as something that over the long haul, it's going to help the stuff that you're doing in the gym or your hill work or whatever you're doing. And in the end, you're going to end up better with it. But it's not a short-term performance enhancing kind of supplement.
And creatine is involved with creatine phosphate, which is what you specialize in that extremely short, high intensity things like hill sprints or like hard lifting exercises. Correct. Awesome. And then 2 more questions. Justin says, are there specific power to weight ratios runners should aim to achieve with certain lifts to optimize running performance? So do you have any baselines where if a runner weighs 70 kilograms, they should be able to lift X amount times their body weight for a strength movement?
I don't think that information is out there right now. And I'm not saying I've spent days scouring the internet to find that. I think that strength as a concept for endurance athletes is still relatively new enough that we don't have a lot of historical data. And I don't think anybody really sat down and looked at that. There's some of those things for football, but the one thing we do know is it's not a direct correlation necessarily. So we can kind of look at things and go, okay, most of the people who are at this level are lifting X number of pounds relative to their body weight. But it also doesn't mean you're going to take somebody who can achieve that level and then go have the same degree of success when they actually go into a race environment. So right now, I don't think that information is out there. I think it could be useful down the road, but more in general ranges versus trying to get to something specific.
Awesome. And then last question here from Patrick. He says, with deadlifts, we are training the glutes, having both fast and slow twitch fibers. How is this best executed? Little reps with high load, combined with high reps with little load, or just somewhere in the middle, say 10 to 15 reps with intermediate weight?
Yes. So all of those things should be really put in. There's not a one size fits all. So you need to change the stress. So there are going to be windows where I have athletes deadlifting for 10 reps, and then there are going to be windows where we're deadlifting for more like 4 to 6 reps. So the rep scheme is just based on changing things up to allow you to continue to develop. One thing I do want to throw in with the deadlift, and this is just kind of, I'm always a safety person. So I look at things and go, how do we get the most out of an exercise? And how do we limit or hopefully minimize the opportunity to get hurt? So a lot of what I do is I don't have athletes pull deadlifts from the floor. So when you think about a traditional deadlift and the bar is down there on the floor, I don't really pull from that range. I pull from kind of what's referred to as the hang position or at their knees. So I'm still going to put them in a squat rack where that bottom position is just below knee height. Or if I don't have a rack, I'm going to build up the height of the weight. But having people pull from range up, you're strengthening the muscles through the same angles you're going to use when you run, but you're cutting out that range where things tend to go a little bit sideways and people can get in trouble. So don't assume that you just have to take something, a stock deadlift, and that's the way you have to do it. You could do, they call them rack pulls, variety of other names for them, but keeping it in a safer range so that you get strength, but you're also minimizing risk.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. And I think that's probably a consideration that, again, speaking from personal experience or the experience of an endurance athlete, they see a blanket term for one exercise. You say, okay, deadlift, I YouTube it really quick and I see for the first thing I have to lift a really heavy weight off only the ground. I think this is a great consideration, at least to change the mindset about somebody that's coming from that endurance side and approaching trying to add in the strength. I have one more question before we wrap up here. And sure. You mentioned at the very top of the show that one of the athletes you work with is Jake Riley, and he finished second at the U.S. Olympic Marathon Trials, had that huge kick, 600 meters to go, his handed American flag, and he had to, kick home with American flag out kicking a couple other athletes. You mentioned that you added in a couple of strength, things to his program, a couple different exercises to incorporates to help with the uphills and downhills of the Atlanta Marathon course. Could you just talk a tiny bit before we wrap up about some approaches that you used with Jake for his strength training before he placed second at the U.S. Olympic Marathon Trials?
Yeah, sure. And everybody definitely keep in mind, don't just take this and then put it into play. I'm giving you a little background on what Jake and I worked on going into that race. Not so much here's what everybody needs to go out and do. But, with Jake, it was a little different situation because he had about a 3-year window, couldn't train, couldn't put in the mileage. So when he came to Boulder and didn't have that opportunity to do a lot of run training, had to get surgery and all that, he did a fantastic job of focusing on the things that he could work on. So from the strength side, he was aggressive. We went after it because we knew we didn't have run training that we had to worry about, at least through certain windows of time. So part of it was, 2 years ago, Jake making a commitment to really put forth that effort in the gym versus just kind of checking the boxes. Now, on the more specific side, I used to live in the Southeast and been to Atlanta several times. So, and I've run the Atlanta Marathon a couple of times. So I was very familiar with the terrain that was going to be there. And that's always going to make it a much bigger challenge when you get down to that last 5K or whatever it is, and you're carrying all that fatigue. So we did some definite, very high weight stuff and in the low reps. But then we went through a little bit of a, transition phase going into the race where we strung together some combinations where it was a circuit using his legs, but at about a 40 to 60% load intensity, but it was a 7 or 8 minute long circuit. And then we would go through several rounds of that. So it was just taking some of that strength and then giving him the ability to produce that time and time again. And that heavier strength training, we can never say 100% we know this did that. But, definitely when we start looking at things like a kick, pulling in type 2 fibers, I think the more of a strength background you have in that, the more it's going to help you when you get there. But that was Jake coming from here and his training with his coach Lee Troop. So I think the strength had a little bit to do to be helpful, but that's going to come down to who Jake is as well as his coaching.
Yeah, totally. The last kind of question we have here is we just talked about an athlete that qualified for the 2020 Olympics, and the Olympics got pushed back to 2021. How do you foresee the future of the elite side of the sport, the recreational runner side of the sport, the competitive amateur? Where do you think this kind of goes just based off the current situation? What are your general thoughts on the near future or the semi near future of running in general?
Yeah, I think the near future, because right now it's all uncertainty. All you have to do is watch the news, and something they're talking about on Monday night, it may not be the same case on Wednesday night. And it's understandable. This is something that we've never gone through. We've never seen this, so we don't really know. Obviously, the virtual side of the equation is really coming into play now. So I have some athletes that are, the races they were signed up for, they're still going to go ahead and do them, but it's as a virtual race. I know Ironman right now is doing a whole series where they have pros racing against each other over the weekends. So you're going to see more of that going on. But I think the ultimate game changer, watch the news, Fauci, it's once we can get a vaccine and then figure out how to get all this under control. So I'm an optimist. I would like to think we're going to get to a point where we can get this under control and we can go back to, quote unquote, normal or some version of that. But it's just going to come down to, whether or not we can get a handle on controlling the spread of this, because close proximity is always going to be an issue when something like this is going on. And obviously that's what goes on in races. So, I think we're going to have a lot more going on the virtual side of the equation, at least until we get a handle on this. And then hopefully, we're not going to be too far off when we go into 2021, feeling like we should have felt going into this year.
Totally. We actually had one last question that wraps everything up perfectly. Leonardo asks, do you offer any type of online service with KP Performance with video evaluation and online routine? So maybe answering this question and plugging KP Performance one more time for our listeners.
I guess I can do that. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a big fan of the screening process. I think you need to have some kind of information before you just start throwing a collection of exercises at somebody. And this is something I'm going to be putting out over the next week or so. I'm doing a little promotion on it. And so what I have is it's about 14 different movements. The person videos themselves doing all the movements. You upload that to my website. And then I go through with just like Coach's Eyes, what I use, just one of the analytics software. And what I do is a narrated version. So I'm going to send it back to you where I'm describing everything I'm seeing, probably drawing some lines, saying this looks good, this doesn't look as good. And it's to go back to that why component we talked about earlier, where when I give an athlete a series of exercises, I want them to connect the exercise with the why. So yeah, we're doing this stretch because see here, you really didn't have the ability to move through that position. So that's always step one for me. We go through that movement screening. And then from there, I have some people that are on team programs and some that are also on individual programs. So by all means, there's a contact form on my website. Feel free to go on there, send a message, and then we can connect and see how we can best help you out. But over the next week, I'm going to be talking about the screening component. And, probably a good time to do that because we don't have a lot of other opportunities. So people can video, send it in. I'll do the eval, send it back, as well as a selection of things that I think will help correct whatever it is we're seeing in that movement screen.
Awesome. Well, I have found this so helpful today. Again, I love following the content that you put out, but I know for everybody watching, everybody going to listen and watch later, it's been so helpful. We love having this kind of mix of topics that we can talk about. Do you have any other thoughts or anything else that you wanted to bring up today? Otherwise, we can definitely wrap it up.
No, not really. That take home is just focus on the things you can focus on. So if you spend, 90% of your time worrying about the things that you aren't able to do right now, you're going to lose a month or 2 months or whatever this time window is going to be. If you turn around and, one question I always have for athletes after they race is, tell me the good stuff that went on. Mm-hmm. And then the follow-up question is, tell me the stuff that didn't go quite as well. So we can frame that in this context, which is, what do I do pretty well with everything, and what kinds of things do I need to work on? And let's put hyper focus into what we need to work on, because for the vast majority, it's not, a 300-pound deadlift that's going to be their main concern. It's going to be ankle mobility or something like that. So put your focus towards the things that you can work on. You will come out a better athlete when we get to the other side of this.
Awesome. Well, Kevin, thank you so much again for coming on. We really, really appreciate it. I know I found it super useful. We will be back with another episode later this week. And everybody, if you want to learn more information, feel free to click the link in the description or the show notes. For now, this was the next episode of Stryd for the Love of Running webinar. Kevin, thanks so much. We'll see you later.
All right, keep up the good work. Appreciate you guys.
Bye-bye.